Well, welcome to our next episode of the Apocalypse. This is episode 3, and in just a few minutes we'll begin our study of the 3rd chapter in our notes. Speaking of our notes, we've had several people that have contacted us this week asking for their free PDF copy. We are offering a free PDF of the first 6 chapters that were all that was created when we started 2 or 3 weeks ago. And when we finish these 6, hopefully there'll be the next set of 6 that we can make available to you. We just believe that if you've got the manuscript to follow along with, you'll be able to get more out of them. You'll be able to have the documentation for what we're saying and so forth. Now, if you happen to be watching these videos a year or so from now, and we've already are no longer doing them live, in which case we hope that we will have taken the manuscript and corrected it and made it available on Amazon.com. So you would have to be able to check there to see if the manuscript was then available. We want to say welcome to the new people that have contacted us this week. We've had Marco in Vienna, Austria. We've had Eddie in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Albert in Canberra, Australia. Ben in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Welcome, Ben. Sylvia from Lancaster, California. David and Nancy in Anderson, Indiana. Austin from Norman, Oklahoma. Rick from Merced, California. And Bobby from Denver, Colorado. Welcome to each of you. John and Laura in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Martha from Allentown, Pennsylvania. James in Trinity, Florida. Marion in Holyrood, Newfoundland, Canada. Brandon in Chickasha, Oklahoma. Holly Marie in Cumming, Georgia. And Jill from Jacksonville, Florida. So welcome to each one of you, as well as those of you that have already been watching us. And again, if you haven't yet contacted us, or this is your first time to find us, if you would like to have the manuscript, they're free. We would just ask that you give us your name and the city and state, or the city and country from which you watch us. We don't do anything with the information. That's just me. There's no staff here to be doing anything. I assure you, you'll probably never get a mail out from us. And I will attempt to always answer an email if you send it, but we're just a small operation. In fact, we are astounded that people are out there watching this. This ministry was started here at St. Elijah in-house for our own people, and through the efforts in the past of Jerry Tolan and today Richard Yeager and Charlie Ward, this is being taped and made available to you. And in fact, one of the listeners that contacted us a couple of weeks ago, Vasilios in Tauville, Switzerland, sent an email that I got just before we started taping today, that had read through the first 90 pages of the manuscript and had sent me a list of typographical mistakes that needed, or spelling and so forth, errors in it, which I greatly appreciate. And I replied to him, I think that it says on the copyright page that it's a copyright of a rough edition. And I'm sure you're discovering how rough the edition happens to be. You're reading the actual first draft of what we have. And so it's hurriedly as it comes to the mind, goes onto the page typed, and that's what we have. That hopefully through this efforts we will be able to correct all of that stuff. But most importantly, that we'll be able to share the apocalypse in an understandable way. You will recall so far we're talking about dealing with the historical aspects, the background for the apocalypse. In fact, all of Unit 1 is going to deal with the historical background to the apocalypse. And I used the metaphor before of putting a jigsaw puzzle together, that we're not just talking about memorizing pieces to the jigsaw puzzle. We want to put them together and be able to see the picture. And what we're doing, if I can continue to use the metaphor, is that we are putting together the bottom edge, the bottom portion of the puzzle, the historical base upon which the rest of the story, the rest of the puzzle will exist. In Unit 2, when we finally get to Unit 2, is going to be dealing with the history inside the apocalypse as we go through it chapter by chapter. And then it's after we've built the base and the middle ground, we hope then, God willing, to be able to deal with the upper level of the jigsaw puzzle we're putting together, to actually begin to arrive at the mystagogic understanding of the apocalypse and what John is saying to us, or what Christ through John is saying to us. So today let's begin with chapter 3. Now chapter 3 is a long chapter. It is historical, and because of that, rather than wear you completely out in an extra long session, today's session will only be the first part of chapter 3, and we will finish next week with the second part of chapter 3 in the manuscript. We're going to deal with an extensive excursus dealing with emperor worship. It is a topic typically unknown to us in our own cultural experience, and therefore, if we're going to understand the role that emperor worship, worshiping the Roman emperor, has to play in the apocalypse, we need to understand the deep-seated cultural existence of the worship of emperors in Middle Eastern culture. So let us begin with statues and power. Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we dealt with this, I think, last time together, that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream. Daniel interpreted the dream about the great giant statue, the head of gold, the chest of silver, the trunk of upper thighs of iron, and then the feet of clay. And in fact, Nebuchadnezzar did build a giant, huge statue, and it was to this giant statue that the three Hebrew youths, known by their non-Hebrew names to most of us, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down and were thrown into the fiery furnace. So Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue became reality. He built a golden statue which was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. It was Nebuchadnezzar's statue that the three Hebrew youths refused to bow down to and to worship. You remember they said, "Our God is able to save us from the burning furnace. But if not, let it be known to you, O King, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image you set up." The strength and power of a ruler, of a kingdom, or an empire is often symbolized in the larger-than-life size of statues and monuments. We can think of, in our own case, the statue of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. If standing, Lincoln would be 28 feet tall, or the size of the Washington Monument, 555 feet tall, both of those in Washington, D.C. These would be present-day examples. The ziggurats, the towers of Babel, the ziggurats that still exist, the ruins of them in Mesopotamia, and the statues of Ramses II in Egypt would be sufficient examples that the power of the country was symbolized in the colossal size of monuments and statues. At the very least, public buildings and statuary are symbols of power. Negative examples, such as the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, or the toppling, defacing, or removal of the statues of Confederate generals in the United States, demonstrate the association of power embodied in statues, and the overthrowing of the statue itself represents an overthrow of the power represented by the statue. The modern idea of democracy, the very term means people power, often camouflages the dynamics and the singularity of power within a society. Montesquieu, in his groundbreaking analysis of political power in a democracy and the division of political power in monarchical England, in his book, The Spirit of Laws, spoke of the danger of extreme democracy when instead of electing officials to pass laws and govern in their behalf, the people, incapable of bearing the very power they have delegated to these elected officials, want to manage everything for themselves, to debate for the Senate, to execute and to decide the judges. Montesquieu is most known for recognizing that in every government there are three sorts of power: the legislative to make the law, the executive to carry out the law, and the judiciary power to judge whether someone is guilty of breaking the law. Montesquieu applauded the separation of powers found in the constitutional monarchy in England and most kingdoms in Europe, while frowning on Turkey, where these powers are united in the Sultan and the subjects groan under the most dreadful oppression. In other words, Montesquieu was pointing out, if you concentrate all the power in the single individual of the ruler, you have no recourse. There's no balance taking place. So he's analyzing and the birth of our modern concept of the separation of powers to prevent then the oppression of an emperor or an autocratic king or ruler. So you see, we today do not have the experience in recent memory of this autocratic rule where all of the power is concentrated inside a single person. Prior to the modern era of the glorious revolution in England in 1688 and the Constitution of the United States in 1788, 100 years later, Montesquieu wrote his book between these two events, Kingdoms and Empires Prior to 1688, consolidated power in one person: kings, pharaohs, sultans, emperors. We are so accustomed to living in a world with a division of power that it is very difficult for us to fathom, much less fully appreciate, living in a world of absolute power, consolidated and embodied within the statue of its king, its pharaoh, its sultan, or its emperor. The consolidation of power within a society creates the potential for persecution and oppression, whether that consolidation is in the state, in a person, in a religion, or even a majority of the people themselves. If you consolidate the power into some kind of singularity. Well, there are additional forms of power in a culture, in a society, besides the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Montesquieu described the division into its functional parts: the making of the laws, the carrying out of the laws, and the judging by the laws. Montesquieu applauded those systems of government in which these separate functions of political power were not embodied in a single person or institution. Montesquieu focused on the separate functions of political power. Now, I know, golly, I thought we were dealing with history. Now we've got a political science course. If we're going to deal with the worship of the emperor, we've got to understand how power is embodied and working in that singularity. Montesquieu did not speak of the broader category of power itself and the separate divisions of power itself. You've got political power, but you also have moral power or religious power consolidated in a religious structure or institution. You have an economical power, the power of the economy, the power of those owners of the economy. There's also an educational power, the power of education and shaping the minds of the culture and the minds of the youth. We could also talk about military power, the power of might and force inside a culture. And then there would be others that we might be able to look at as they exist. By 1748, Montesquieu could omit religion from being a political function. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 broke the symbiotic unity of Western Catholic religion and Charlemagne's Western Holy Roman Empire that had existed since Christmas Day 800 AD, when the Pope had crowned Charlemagne the emperor of a newfangled thing called the Holy Roman Empire. The religion of the ruler then became the religion of the people. I've got it printed in Latin. I don't speak Latin, so I won't try to slaughter the Latin. But the religion of the ruler becomes the religion of the people, which is what brought about all the British English Civil War, because Henry was Catholic until he couldn't get a divorce, and then he became Protestant, Anglican, and then his successor was a daughter Mary, and she was Catholic, and so England kept going back and forth to be the religion of the ruler until Elizabeth, and then eventually the Puritans and the Civil War that the Puritans brought, attacking the government, wanting to have their own Puritan dictatorship in England. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 finally recognized Calvinism as an official religion. The Peace of Augsburg had said if the ruler is Lutheran, the people are Lutheran. If the ruler is Catholic, the people are Catholic. They recognized two official religions. 1648 now added Calvinism, Presbyterianism, as a third legitimate religion inside the Western sovereignty that was there. After 1648, Western Europe became a mixture of independent sovereign states, nations, alongside what was left of Charlemagne's Western Holy Roman Empire. When Montesquieu wrote his book in 1748, the remains of Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire had only 60 years left before its death by Napoleon in 1806. 300 years after Luther and Calvin's Protestant Reformation, the last remnant of the Holy Roman Empire, the western end of the Holy Roman Empire, was gone. The modern era of independent sovereign states had begun. It's a newfangled thing. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution in England separated religious belief from political loyalty. You could be a loyal British citizen, loyal to the crown, without being a member of the Church of England. In 1748, Montesquieu assumed the omission of the religious from the functions of political power. He could openly state, Montesquieu, "We are politicians and not divines, but the divines themselves, the religious ones, must agree that there is a great difference between tolerating a religion and approving of religion." Modern states, after 1688, no longer endorsed a particular religion. They now chose to tolerate religion within their countries. When the legislature has believed it is a duty to permit, to allow the exercise of many different religions, it is necessary that he should enforce a toleration among these religions themselves. I'm quoting Montesquieu. It is a principle that every religion which is persecuted becomes itself persecuting when given the chance. For as soon as by some accidental turn it rises from persecution, it attacks the religion which persecuted it, not as a religion, but as a tyranny. It is necessary then, still quoting Montesquieu, that the law of the nation require from the several different religions not only that they shall not embroil, start a fight, but they shall not raise disturbances among themselves. Religion collectively cannot raise a fight with culture, nor can they individually start a fight with one another, different religions. 1748, the principle, this is religion, is now outside of the political realm, and it only exists in the contemporary world by the permission of the particular state, the particular government in which it finds itself. Welcome to the 21st century. 40 years after Montesquieu wrote these words, the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States declares, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Respecting a religion. We're not going to pick one, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Religion will be acceptable, but we're not going to pick one, and we're not going to stop you from practicing yours within implied the conditions that Montesquieu has already said. The religion doesn't attack the country and doesn't start attacking other religions. Barely 500 years after Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle in Germany, Wittenberg Church, today the memory of empire is gone in the West, outside of textbooks. The political air we breathe is that of the separation of church and state. At the beginning of the 21st century, the issue is not the difference between establishing a state religion or tolerating all religions. That's what they were fighting back in 1776, or back in 1688, or back with Henry at the beginning of the 1500s. The issue today increasingly is whether any religion should be even tolerated inside the 21st century modern state. To understand the world in which the apocalypse was written, we must therefore step outside our American democratic understanding of the freedom of religion and the role of religion in politics and culture, and the separation of religion from politics. We must step back thousands of years before Christ into ancient cultures and empires in which the absolute ruler, whether a king or called a pharaoh or some other title, was either a sacred vicar of the chief god of the people or was considered a god himself. Therefore, we turn now to the topic of divine kingship in the ancient Middle East. Believe it or not, all this is headed somewhere, and where it's headed is to the apocalypse. The rulers of ancient Mesopotamia, you know that the Fertile Crescent we all maybe remember from junior high and high school. The rulers of ancient Mesopotamia often considered themselves, or were considered by their subjects, to be gods. The first to do so was a man known as Nerum of Akkad, the grandson of Sargon I in southern Mesopotamia in 2300 BC. That would be what? Of over 4,300 years ago. Sargon I, his grandfather, is thought to be the first person in recorded history to create and rule an empire that covered the then known world. The geographical vastness of Sargon's empire, known as the Sargon geography, stretched from the Persian Gulf, modern-day Kuwait, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, possibly Lebanon, and across lower Turkey along the Mediterranean coast. Pretty much almost all of the Fertile Crescent except Egypt. The beginning of human civilization began in the southeastern end to the Persian Gulf end of Mesopotamia. Now, time does not allow us to take even a slight detour to Sumer and Akkad, to Sargon I and his daughter Enheduanna, the first poet of record in all of human history. Enheduanna's writings are the earliest work of an author known to be an historical figure and identified by name in the poems and hymns she wrote. The author that actually wrote them is the earliest recorded person that we have that actually wrote a document. Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon I, Nerum Sin's great aunt, wrote some of her hymns and poetry during the reign of her great nephew. For over 1,000 years, the scribes of ancient Mesopotamia continued to copy onto clay tablets inscriptions from statues set up by these two kings, Sargon I and Nerum Sin, in numerous temples throughout southern Mesopotamia. The original monuments have since disappeared from the location where they once were, many of them carried off 1,200 years later to Susa, that would be what in modern-day Persia, by the Elamites. Babylonian rulers Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus, whose son Belshazzar was the last ruler of Babylon, during whose reigns the Babylonian captivity of ancient Israel occurred. So, if we're going to talk about Israeli history and ancient Israel history and the history of Judah that plays a role in the apocalypse, we have to remember that Babylon conquered Jerusalem and took the ancient Israelites captive to Babylon, and for 70 years they lived there in the very area and under the very rulers we're talking about. So this is a small historical world, if you will, ancient history to us, but a very much living history at the time of the apocalypse. They all knew about Babylon, Persia, the coming of the Greeks, and the coming of the Romans. They knew and lumped together the story and sequence of these political/religious kingdoms. To this day, 4,400 years later, the name Akkad is used to refer to the oldest known manifestation of the Semitic language family, the Akkadian or the Akkadian. Well, let's look at this Nerum Sin. Nerum Sin sought to exceed his grandfather, Sargon I. Well, I know someone's already looking for a glass of water or wait a minute. Was that something else I saw you take a drink from? I know, history. Goodness. Nerum's sin not only repeated the successes of his predecessors, he sought to distinguish himself and not just be portrayed as a prominent ruler. He wanted to be not just portrayed like them. Been wearing a mask all day and it affects my nose. He wanted to be prominent by doing things never done before, such as the discovery of new routes and the conquest of areas never before subjugated by his own people. The assertions of innovative greatness were everywhere in Nerum Sin's empire. One stele set up in a distant places, these huge rock-like monuments that would have something carved on it. In Anatolia, in center of Turkey, and in Assyria, as well as reliefs carved on inaccessible rocks on the sides of mountains. One example is the victory stele of Nerum Sin that celebrates the victory of the Akkadian monarch over Satuni, king of the Lalubi, a tribe in the Zagros Mountains, the northern edge of Mesopotamia. And in this stele, this monument, it depicts Nerum Sin ascending the mountain, trampling on the bodies of his enemies in the image of a god. Like his grandfather, he claimed himself king of the four quarters of the universe, but in a bolder move, began writing his name with a sign, a mark, designating himself a god on equal footing with any gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. We've actually got a picture of this very stele in your manuscript, and Richard will have it embedded in the finished edited video prepared from this seminar. The victory stele of Nerum Sin is today located in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. This large victory stele of exceptional quality, carved in pink limestone, was found not in Mesopotamia where it was originally, but at the Iranian site of Susa. It had been taken there 1,000 years after it was created in the 12th century BC by the Elamite king Shutruk Nahunte, along with considerable booty collected during his victorious campaign in Babylon. A major work, this stele, illustrating the imperial art of the Akkadian dynasty. This victory stele celebrates the triumph of King Nerum Sin over a mountain people, the Lalubi. The Akkadian king led his troops over the steep slopes of the enemy territory, mercilessly crushing all resistance, and the conqueror's victory march is coupled with his personal ascension of a sovereign who would now claim equal footing with the gods. You can see him there clearly, standing on top and out on top near the top of the stele as a god. The victory ascension chiseled in stone thus celebrates a sovereign who considers himself on an equal footing with the gods. In official inscription, Nerum Sin's name was therefore preceded with a divine determinative that mark signaling divinity. He pushed back the frontiers of the empire farther than they had ever been, from Ebla in Syria to Susa in Persia, and led his army where no other king had gone before him. Nerum's sin began characterizing himself as a god. In a different victory still than the one we just looked at, his victory over a rebellion of the Sumerian city-states turned him into a superhuman, quasi-divine figure. During his own lifetime, therefore, Nerum's sin was made the god of his city. This victory stele, the other one that I don't have a picture of, carried this inscription: Nerum's sin, the mighty king, the king of Akkad. When the four quarters of the world gathered together against him, he was, thanks to the love that Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar, showed him, victorious in 9 battles in a single year, and captured those kings that had risen against him. Because he could strengthen his city in this plight, the citizens of his city wished him to be god of their city, with permission from the goddess Ishtar in Inanna, God Enlil in Nippur, Dagon in Tutul, Ninkurhasag in Kesh, Enki in Eridu, Sin in Ur, Shamash in Sippur, and so forth. In the middle of Akkad, the city of Akkad, they erected his Nerum sin's temple. As the human Nerum sin becomes the protective deity of his city and of its citizens, he fulfills for them the function that a protective deity, personal protective deity, did for the individual. As a city god of Akkad, Nerum sin becomes its owner, and this possessive relationship between king and city is expressed for the first time in these inscriptions. First man in history that we have any record of being called a god by his own people, and his own people building a temple for him to dwell in their city. So Nerum sin is the first emperor to style himself a god and to be treated by his citizens as a god. His grandfather, Sargon I, was the first emperor in recorded history. However, it was Nerum sin who created the paradigm of power, conquering essentially what was the known world and elevating himself to the status of a living God. A paradigm of power creates that template that couples territorial conquest with the admiring adoration of your own people and the hero worship, the God worship of the throng of followers. Nerum sin's paradigm of power, territorial conquest, and becoming a god is going to be followed by emperors for thousands of years in Mesopotamia, the Middle East, Egypt, and the Roman Empire, even at the time of the apocalypse. Well, to go ahead and expand this a little further, questioning this paradigm, the curse of Akkad, Before considering the use of the paradigm of power, territorial conquest, and being deified that is going to be used by the Greeks and the Romans, let us note that this paradigm of power, conquest, and claims of divinity was not accepted without eventual reflection. Oops. Within 1,500 years after Nerum sinned, so it took him 1,500 years, the Curse of Akkad had been written, which at the very least questions this paradigm of making a conquering king into a god, or if stronger, is a literary protest against the whole paradigm. Whether it is or not is beside us. What is important for us is that this literary document dealing with the curse of power even exists in the first place. The Curse of Akkad is part of a Mesopotamian literary group, a genre, which features a famous person, usually the king, a king and person from history, as the main character in the story, in a didactic tale, which almost always concern humanity's relationship with the gods. Now that humans, rulers, are being deified, it raises the question, what is the true relationship of human beings with the gods? These tales are not historical. You might think of them more like the stories of ancient Greece that Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides are going to turn into plays. They are at least maybe quasi-historical in that the figure that they are about existed, though that character never did the things that are used in the story. This literature, written perhaps within 500 years after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, Sargon, as the founder of the empire that united and brought all of Mesopotamia together, he is always used to teach positive values, the way Parson Weems used his invented stories of George Washington, I cannot tell a lie, chopping down a tree, use a historical person in a fictional setting to try to teach youngsters across a new colonial, now emerging America to not tell a lie. Naram sin, on the other hand, is consistently used as a negative example of a king who makes bad choices that led to the destruction of the Akkadian Empire. It is possible that Naram Sin's reputation fared badly because later generations were not comfortable with the style of a ruler who understood power and used it deliberately and imaginatively to attain his goals. The specific motif is the claim of divinity. The Curse of Akkad tells the story of the destruction of the city of Akkad by the will of the gods, owing to Naram Sin's impiety. The other gods, the real gods of Mesopotamia, are going to bring about the destruction of Naram Sin's empire as punishment for his claiming to be divine, in other words. In the story, Naram Sin destroys the temple, the Ikur, of the god Enlil in the city of Nippur. Historically, there is no evidence that Naram Sin literally did this. However, metaphorically, the eventual collapse and defeat of the Akkadian Empire is attributed centuries later, attributed backwards to Naram Sin's arrogant usurpation of divinity. In the story, in a dream, Naram Sin sees that Akkad's future is bleak, and so imposes upon himself a period of mourning and prayer. For 7 years he remains in a penitential state, waiting for an answer from the gods, and then he takes matters into his own hands. If the gods will not come and answer him, he will go to them and force them to answer. The gods of Mesopotamia the people expected them literally to live in the temple of their cities. When Naram Sin destroys the temple in Nippur, he is destroying the God Enlil's actual house, not just a symbolic house of worship. That God actually lived in the house, dwelled there. And lines 127 and 128 of the story read this way: the people, once the temple is destroyed, could see the bedchamber, its room which knows no daylight, the very inner room where the god slept at night, totally protected from all the other rooms around that room. The Akkadians could look into the holy treasure chest of the gods. This was beyond sacrilege. This was the intentional destruction and desecration of a god's house, of his home, from which his personal belongings were then stolen. In his rage against the silence of the gods, he engaged in the most unforgivable kinds of actions. Now just stop and remember, if Naram Sin, it becomes the prototype, sets the example, at some point, even in this story here, he's made out to be a bad guy. He's a bad guy because he destroys somebody else's God, somebody else's temple. That will come to mind later in our story when Antiochus IV will attack Jerusalem, wants to destroy the Jewish religion, and wants to force all the Israelites to eat pigs that have been slaughtered on the altar in Jerusalem. Antiochus IV will embody this arrogant, the other people's gods that is now being attributed to the very first ruler to ever think of himself as a god. This is not then just hypothetical thinking. We're talking about creating a mindset that every ruler thereafter begins to try to implement and live up to, even the negative parts of that paradigm. Aside from the right relationship between the gods and a king, the story would also have warned against taking up arms against the gods, whether physically or spiritually, in that one was entering a battle one could not possibly win. If Antiochus IV represents, way centuries later, someone embodying Nerum Sin, the God's retaliation represents the genre of apocalyptic literature. It is the apocalyptic literature using apocalyptic language and symbols that portrays the final battle of the true gods against the wicked ones of earth, war against the very struggle of power, and the power claimed by the king, the emperor, is going to be lived and out all the way to the first century from what we say 20, I forget now the date a while ago, 2500 BC or whatever it was, 2400 BC. Narum's sin marks a turning point in human history. He identified imperial power with the power of the gods. Nerum's sin's appropriation of the divine has far-reaching consequences in the history of rulers and empires. Rulers before him were not divinized, while rulers after him were divinized. Even Sargon I was deified after the fact by his grandson, Nerum sin. Later, Mesopotamian rulers will bring offerings to the statues of this deified Nerum sin and the posthumously deified Sargon. The Curse of Akkad was probably composed centuries later by these priests of Nippur as an object lesson to rulers who would favor any deity over their God Enlil. The priesthood of Nippur may have warned against innovation and advocated the maintenance of the traditional theology of Mesopotamia. At the same time, the very same priest continued to honor the statue of the deified Nerum sin in the temple, in the mountain house temple of the god Enlil in Nippur. So millennia before, thousands of years before the concept of the separation of church and state, separation of religion and empire could even be imagined, the Curse of Akkad expressed at least an ideological concern for the right relationship of the gods and the absolute monarch, the right relationship of religion and the government, religion and the state, and the government, the king, the ruler, claiming to be divine. Human culture and civilization began in Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago. The issues we face and how we think about them are derivatives filtered through Greece and Rome from ancient Mesopotamia. It was in Mesopotamia that the creation of the calendar led to the domestication of crops and the domestication of animals. Known as the Neolithic Revolution, the birth of farming created a sustainable food supply, which in turn led to the birth of human cities, from which all human culture and civilizations derive. Our Neolithic ancestors domesticated animals, domesticated crops. They invented writing, accounting, mathematics, astronomy, and educational systems. They built cities and created worship centers, governments, and empires. It was in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, that cities and civilizations were founded. Noted Mesopotamian expert Samuel Noah Kramer lists 39 firsts in recorded history, and his history begins in Sumer. Demes, Shmat, Bezerat revolutionized our understanding of writing that occurred in ancient Mesopotamia. Gwynedd focused on the creation of the cities themselves as the most enduring legacy of Mesopotamia. I might argue that it's the politics and relation of the gods to politics. It was in Mesopotamia that the very first cities were created, and where the familiar sites of urban life, public buildings, gardens, places of worship, even streets and pavement were originally invented. Also invented, as we've just seen, is the divinity of the king. After his defeat of the rebellion against Akkad, Nerum sin refers to the circumstances of his divinization in an inscription on a statue which says, "The citizens of Akkad implored the gods to have him as the god of their city, and they built him a temple in the midst of Akkad." When our Neolithic ancestors left the Zagros Mountains and entered the Mesopotamian plain, they brought their mountain gods with them. On the plains, they built man-made mountains as a home for the mountain gods when they moved into Mesopotamia. These man-made mountains of Mesopotamia came to be called ziggurats. These mountain of God became the dwelling place of the mountain gods upon the plains of Mesopotamia. Their gods lived on the man-made mountains, the temples they built for them. Mesopotamian religion never fully envisaged the transcendental, infinite presence of gods. It needed them tied to a place. Their holy bedchamber, that inner room, occupied the inner recesses of the temple estate. Heaven was no further away than the temple roof. By providing the gods with lodging and sustenance, the city partook of the essence of divinity. Each Mesopotamian city was a self-governing city-state, a self-governing political unit with its own ziggurat or dwelling place for its personal city god. Even when Sargon conquered other cities and united them into his empire, the city gods of those cities remained the god of the conquered city. Therefore, when Nerum sin permitted the cities of Akkad to make him their city god, they built him a house, that is a temple, in the midst of the city. In other texts, Nerum sin is called the god of Akkad. The king had moved officially into a higher category of being, that of a deity, and declared himself to be the main channel of communication between the great gods of the country and his subjects. Statues of the king received the sort of attention hitherto reserved for those of gods, and Akkad, a new city, which unlike Uruk or Eridu could make no claims to be an ancient sacred site, became sacred because it was now the seat of the divine king. In the Curse of Akkad, Nerum sin destroyed the temple of Nippur, which never happened historically. What did happen historically was Nerum sin became the god of his own city. Akkad became sacred not because a mountain deity lived there. Akkad became sacred because Nerum, Sin, the king, lived there. A city in the world today becomes important not because it is any better than any other city, but because it happens to be the place the seat of government is. County seats in counties. We have capitals of states. We have the national capital of countries that are given a higher honor of respect because the government is there. It's a pattern after Nerum sin right here. Akkad became sacred not because a mountain deity lived there. Akkad became sacred because Nerum, Sin, the king, lived there. That was his sacrilege. The curse placed on Akkad was declared in behalf of the city god of Nippur. May the city that destroyed your city be done to as your city. May the human being that did this to your city, may the same now be done to him and his city. Payback. This is the heritage that Nerum Sin gave to the known world. The worship of the king as a god. When Alexander the Great conquered Mesopotamia, that is the heritage that welcomed him as the new ruler of their world. When Alexander the Great conquered Mesopotamia in 331 BC, he wanted to make Babylon the capital of his vast empire. He died before this was done. But under his successors, the balance now swings to the west. The Hellenistic states, and eventually Rome, exported these concepts from Mesopotamia, adapting them to suit the needs of a colonial empire throughout the Mediterranean region and beyond. Of particular interest to us as we consider the apocalypse, it will be and is the concept of divine kingship and the process of divinization of those wielding absolute political power. The divinization of political power is an incredibly important reality and an invisible presence in the background of the apocalypse. The process of deification has close parallels to that of the Roman emperors. In order to understand the apocalypse, we must enter into the cultural realities of the Middle East in the 1st century AD, and the deification of emperors that was deeply embedded in that culture. Let us turn westward from Mesopotamia and follow the deification of emperors as it moved from Mesopotamia to Greece, the Middle East, and then to Rome. Well, I don't know about you, but I could take a break. Wow, we just covered, 2,400 years of that. Hope you are still with us. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back in just a little bit and do just a little bit more, hurriedly trying to get through laying the bottom part of our puzzle piece, this historical context that was still alive and operating in the lives of culture in the 1st century. We'll be back in just a little bit. Thanks. Well, welcome back after our break. I know most of us don't like history and certainly don't like this. Sometimes we have to pay this kind of background to get where we're wanting to go, to discover the richness that's there. When the disciples, Peter, James, and John, went up the mountain of Transfiguration with our Lord, they had to climb the mountain. They didn't take a helicopter to get there. And so you see, often in our lives, if we want to make it and see that vista, that view from the top of the mountain, it comes at the price of climbing the mountain. I have heard others describe that view from being in the Rocky Mountains, and I marvel at their ability to climb the mountain in the first place to get there. So thank you for having climbed that last way with us. What we're going to do now is continue the story, but it's much closer to home and going to be a shorter part before we stop. And then we'll pick this up and finish it with a short session next week before we begin turning more and more towards the apocalypse. So, let us begin now with Alexander the Great and the issue of divine kingship. The available history information on Alexander the Great is quite extensive. The deification of Alexander is documented and still debated from many points of view. Translations of Arrian's The Anabasis of Alexander, Diodorus's Bibliotheca Historica, Plutarch's The Life of Alexander the Great are widely available. C.A. Robinson Jr.'s Alexander's Deification presents a 16-page discussion of the historical sources and the historical interpretations of Alexander's deification from the author Callisthenes all the way up through World War II. So there's an extensive body of literature, historical documents on Alexander the Great and the issue of him being declared a god. Two events acting as bookends, as it were, encapsulate the self-deification of Alexander. The first occurred in Egypt before his campaign going into Mesopotamia and across that into Persia. The second bookend, if the first one is in Egypt before the campaign begins, the second bookend takes place in modern-day Afghanistan after Alexander has conquered Persia. So Egypt, Afghanistan, in between, he has conquered Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Persia, Iran. After the conquest of Egypt itself, Alexander traveled slightly over 300 miles west from Memphis, west from the Nile, into the Libyan desert to the oasis of Siwa to consult the oracle at the temple of Amun, chief god of the Egyptians. Remember Amun-Re? We have there in your manuscript a picture of one of the ruins that's there today at Amun-Re, at Amun. Greek historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD, tells us that the high priest there greeted Alexander with the words, "Welcome from his father Ammon." And Ammon thus called Alexander son of God, since Ammon is the king of the Egyptian gods. When Alexander demanded of the oracle whether any of those who murdered his father Philip remained alive, the high priest rebuked him, telling him he should speak with more respect, since his was not a mortal father. Thus the high priest reminded Alexander that he must behave like a god if he is to be treated as a god. Plutarch also records a second version of Alexander's greeting by the oracle. Others say the priest, desirous as a piece of courtesy to address him in Greek, went to use the Greek language and say, O Paidan, by a slip in pronunciation, ended with the S, the sigma, instead of the N, anew, and said, O Paidios, which mistake Alexander was well enough pleased with, and it went for current that the oracle had called him so. What does that mean? Instead of saying in English, O my son, O Paidion, the priest instead greeted Alexander as, in English, O son of Zeus, O Dios. Scholars can debate what the oracle said, but after his visit to Ammon, Alexander from now on was declared, and he declared himself to be of divine origin. First bookend. The second bookend occurs after the conquering of Iraq and Iran. Second bookend is an event near the end of Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire. In the final battle against the Persians, Alexander's forces gained the upper hand, and Darius, king of kings of the Persian Empire, fled the field of battle, only later to be assassinated by one of his generals, Besus, who claimed the throne and fled to Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan. Known in antiquity as Bactria, Afghanistan emerged as a danger zone in direct response to Alexander's power throughout the Middle East. With the defeat of Darius, the campaign to end the Persian threat had been accomplished. The mandate of the Corinthian League, had been achieved. Technically, the alliance had finished its job with the fall of Persia. The Macedonians wanted to go home, as did the Greek soldiers as well. The venture to now pursue Besus and invade Afghanistan was an entirely new war. It called for a coalition of Macedonian and Greek soldiers and Persian cavalry, the enemy they had just defeated. It was in Bactria, Afghanistan, the issue of Alexander's deification led to a rebellion against Alexander. After defeating the Persians, but before beginning the Bactria campaign, Alexander began adopting the Persian style of kingship. Diodorus of Sicily says Alexander began then to imitate the luxurious Persian lifestyle and the extravagance of Eastern kings. He formed a bodyguard primarily of Persians. In his court, he made use of Persian ushers and pages. He also took to wearing the Persian diadem and dressed in white clothes without a colored border, wore a Persian sash, and wore all of the Persian outfit except trousers and a Candace kind of shawl. Alexander's adoption of some aspects of Persian court protocol and the wearing of Persian regalia, his marriage to an Afghani warlord's daughter, Roxanne, the inclusion of defeated Persian soldiers now into his army, and surrounding himself with foreigners exacerbated tensions which naturally existed between the Greeks, the Macedonians, and created a court that became an ethnic and cultural riot. The added issue of treating Alexander as a god led to a rebellion against Alexander. Known as the Proskinesis event, the introduction into Alexander's court of the Persian custom of prostrating oneself before the king. We've got a diagram of it that's there in your manual. Richard will have it embedded. But it's not just a bow, as some translations would say, but the Greek word means to go to your knees and then out in front, fully horizontal on the floor with your arms outstretched in front of you to a deity, to the king. The introduction to Alexander's court of the Persian custom of prostrating oneself before the king created the occasion in which the multiple frustrations of his own Macedonian and Greek soldiers, that their frustration had with Alexander's behavior, now came to a head. Persians, for example, always do proskinesis before their kings. In the Greek world, however, this same act expressed adoration of a deity, of a god, unless Alexander was indeed a living god. This servile debasement appeared inappropriate to all traditionalists in his retinue, to all of his Greek and Macedonian soldiers. Thus, to practice proskinesis before Alexander seemed unthinkable to the Macedonian and Greeks, and not doing so was unthinkable to the Persians, who had always treated, since the days of Nerum's sin, their emperor, their king, as a god. In Diodorus, the library, 15 full chapters are missing after the defeat of Darius and before the campaign into India. A comment inserted by the editors tells us not only what is missing, but also summarizes the issues of the growing rebellion against Alexander. The editors say, we have lost in this book his account of the difficult conquest of Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander's increasing orientalization, becoming more like a Persian, and its unpopularity, and probably his deification in the early phases of Alexander's campaigns. Some famous incidents took place during these months that are missing. Alexander's marriage to Roxanne, the drunken killing of Clytus, the Pages conspiracy, and the arrest of Callisthenes. The details of these events that are now missing from Diodorus are found in Arrian's The Anabasis of Alexander, beginning in chapter 7. After Alexander's confrontation with and killing of Clytus, Arrian states There is also a current report that Alexander wished men to prostrate. His actual word is proskinesis in the Greek. That they would commit proskinesis before him as to a god, entertaining the notion that Ammon, remember back here in Egypt, was his father rather than Philip, and that he now showed his admiration of the custom of the Persians and the Medes by changing the style of his dress, the alteration he made in the general etiquette of how the court now operated had become more Persian, more deified. Alexander's growing Orientalism, the king's marriage to a Bactrian, his integration of so-called barbarians, the Persians, into his army, his wearing of Persian attire, his ridicule of fallen generals, and his fondness for proskinesis all broke faith with the Macedonian birthright of his army. Historians and scholars debate whether Alexander demanded deification by the Greeks as a political measure in order to achieve unity within his coalition of Macedonian, Greek, Persian, and other foreign soldiers. In other words, how can you have half of your court bowing and the other half not bowing? Meaning, how can you have half of the court laying flat out on the floor before the king like a god, and the other half standing like so? Those on the floor thought those standing were disrespectful, and those standing thought those on the floor were idiots. You now have a divided court based on how do we treat the king. Other scholars suggest that Alexander's worldview changed after the death of Darius, the Persian ruler. At the outset of Alexander's campaign, the worldview of the Greeks and Macedonians had been simply the continuation of the long-standing war between Greece and Persia, a worldview filled with epic battles and tales about the Persian wars. With Darius dead and victory won, Alexander's men wanted to return home. But Alexander now had a new vision with a new world view. Alexander's encounter with the Amazon queen, the Lystress, encapsulates and epitomizes Alexander's new vision, the intermarriage of East and West, Greece and Persia. When Alexander asked the queen of the Amazons why she had come, she said that she wanted to conceive his child. She explained that his achievements proved that there was no man on earth that could compare with him, and that since her strength and courage made her superior to other women, it was likely that any child with two such outstanding parents would surpass all others in valor. The king was charmed, and in the end he granted her request. They spent 13 days together, and then he honored her with valuable gifts and sent her back home. Marriages between Macedonian men and Oriental women were a standard feature of everyday life during Alexander's expedition. By the end of Alexander's campaign, this practice had given birth to a whole generation of mixed descent, for whom the camp was a mobile metropolis. By the latter part of his reign, the Macedonian elite had all become involved in marriage with Persian princesses. The marriage of Greeks and Persians gave birth to a vision of a new world, a world filled with reconciliation and harmonization, a dream that still exists in some. New times call for new measures. The Persians, once the hated enemy, were now to become loyal subjects and even to have a share in power. With the death of Darius, the original purpose of the expedition seemed to complete the chapter of revenge closed. A new chapter had begun. We've defeated, he's dead, that's over. A new chapter had begun. The barbarians would no longer be our archetypical enemy of the past. They had now become a vehicle of reconciliation and harmonization, with malice toward none and charity towards all, Abraham Lincoln would say. Alexander's new vision, embodied in his encounter with the Amazon Queen, was the dream of a united empire of West and East, ruled by the virtuous Alexander and joined by all men of merit. Sounds like Arthur and his knights, doesn't it? Implementing his vision for a new world order, Alexander adopted the royal dress of Persian kings, appointed Persians as his court bodyguards, and introduced the Persian act of proskynesis when greeting their king to his court. Greeks and Macedonians understood proskynesis as an act rendered only before an image of a god and never to a human. The Greeks and Macedonians, therefore, believed the Persians, by giving proskynesis to their king, were thereby worshiping Alexander as a god. Alexander introduced proskynesis at a banquet in which Macedonians and Persians were guests. Alexander had prearranged to leave the banquet momentarily. During his absence, Cleon was to give a speech endorsing proskynesis and calling on Greeks and Macedonians to join him in giving proskynesis to Alexander when Alexander returned to the banquet. You got the picture. It's all prearranged. Alexander's going to momentarily excuse himself. In that absence, Cleon's going to get up and begin urging the other Greeks that when Alexander comes back, come on, let's all lay on the floor and do proskynesis to him. Clearchus, writing in the third person, describes Cleon's speech this way. Cleon embarked upon a speech celebrating the success of Alexander and counting their consequential blessings. He said that there was but one way they could give thanks. If they had deduced his divinity, they were to acknowledge it, recompensing such benefactions at the paltry expense of incense. How can you just do it? Incense. We could do it giving him incense. Indeed, the Persians were not merely pious, but also rational in reverencing their rulers along with the gods. for it was the awesomeness of the empire that secured their safety. Cleon then reminded them history's view of a man depends upon the esteem given to him by his own generation. He said that Hercules nor Dionysus had been deemed deities until they had overcome the envy of their contemporaries, and posterity perceives only much of a man that his own time testified to. In other words, if we don't do it, history will not know how great this man was. Cleon closes his speech declaring he will give proskinesis to Alexander despite those who won't, and challenges all to follow his example. He said that even if the rest of you are irresolute, he himself would prostrate his person upon the ground when the king came back to the banquet. The others owed it to Alexander to do likewise, and those endowed with wisdom foremost, for they should provide the precedent for reverencing their ruler. Of course, only 40 years earlier, Xenophon had inspired the 10,000 not to surrender to their fate of being trapped deep in Persia long before Alexander's campaign. Xenophon reminded the 10,000 they were sons of fathers who worshiped no man as a master, but only the gods. The return of the 10,000s was a living memory for the Greeks and Macedonians. They might accept Alexander's appropriation of Persian attire and marriage. They were unwilling to fall down in what to them was a divine act of worship before Alexander. The resistance by his army resulted in Alexander's murder of Clytus and the execution of Callisthenes. Whether Alexander believed he was divine or merely let the Persians behave toward him as they had always treated their own king, and whether to avoid a divided court with Macedonian and Greeks greeting him in their way and the Persians with their way, that Alexander had required the Macedonian and Greeks to greet him with proskinesis is really not for us the issue. Regardless of Alexander's motivation, whether political or personal belief hardly matters. What does matter and cannot be denied is the fact that the Greek tradition regarded the gesture of proskinesis as an act of divine worship, even though the Persian tradition might not always. And since Alexander had grown up in the Greek tradition, he must have known this and at least not minded. He didn't bring the Persians up off the floor. It is obvious from this discussion that regardless of any Persian or Egyptian influence on future Greek and Roman emperors, to embrace the imperial cult worshiping the emperor and its worship of the emperors, the direct birth of such a practice can be traced to 327 BC, to Alexander the Great's famous banquet in Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan, during which the subject of proskinesis was discussed, and with it the desirability of paying homage to Alexander as a divine personage. regardless of his motive, whether political or personal belief, Alexander introduced the deification of the king into Greek culture. Prior to Alexander's death in Babylon, embassies arrived from Greece, the members of which, with crowns upon their own heads, approached Alexander and crowned him with golden crowns, as if, forsooth, they came to him as special envoys deputed to pay him divine honors, and his end was not far off. What the Macedonian and Greek soldiers rejected at the banquet in Afghanistan, Greece itself initiated at his death. The deification of Alexander the Great. Via the Greeks, the deification of emperors eventually passed into the Roman Empire as well. The worship of Alexander by Greeks in Asia, in Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean world, the worship of Alexander by Greeks in Asia, the province, is well attested and may well have set the example for Europe. Well, wow. We ought to stop here today, give us a chance to catch our breath. What we've seen is the concept is embedded for several thousand years in Mesopotamia. Alexander the Greek, from an event that happened in Egypt before the campaign, believes he is now the son of a god, Ammon. Near the end of the campaign, having conquered Persia, the Persians are now bowing to him, laying prostrate on the floor, that to the Greeks is seen as reverencing a god. Alexander encouraged being treated this way, and after his death, Greece will itself deify Alexander as a god. After his death, his empire is going to be carved up by his generals. And this is bringing us now very close, within 300 years of the birth of Christ and within 400 years of the writing of the Apocalypse. So we will complete chapter 3 next time in our next episode. And we've only got, it'll be a brief one next week. I don't want to start the 4th chapter. I want these to kind of be self-contained for us. And so the next episode will not be as long as this one, as we begin to deal with what's going to happen in the Mediterranean world, in Palestine, Judah, what's going to happen after the death of Alexander the Great, and the beginning to see what will his generals do with this thought of being treated as a god. Well, that'll be next time. We're about to get through the driest part of the history as we get closer and closer to the Apocalypse. Thanks for being part of us. I look forward to your being with us again next week. Thank you.